Hello, Garland Nixon here, hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, and we're going to today talk about Stanford. They're pushing regime change operations as always, and believe it or not, something interesting has happened, and that is Samantha Power from USAID has admitted about some, shall we say, miscreant activity in EU elections, particularly Moldova. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. He is an expert and a historian, and his particular area of expertise and specialty is covert operations, CIA, MI6, all that kind of stuff. And just so you'll know, where would you like to go to find out all that good information? You want to go to, and this is one of my favorite sites, so I got to let you know about this. You got to go to covertactionmagazine.com. It is the best. You see all the stuff there, all this, a lot of stuff about CIA, about operations, and you go to series 9/11, Biden, Israel, Gaza, political assassinations, war in Ukraine, you name it, anything where the intelligence communities were up to no good, which is pretty much everything you can think of that was bad. Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov and his team over at Covert Action Magazine were all over. Now, we've got some semi-breaking information now, but let's talk about good old Samantha Power. Just so you'll know, she's the former head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and now apparently a couple of Russian comedians. And what these guys do, they're pretty good. What they do is they will pretend to be someone, and they'll call some person of power, or my button, some person of power, and they'll pretend to be another person of power, and they will squeeze information out of them, and they're really good. They've gotten some big ones. Well, apparently they now talked to Samantha Power and got her to admit that USAID was pumping money into Moldova for regime change, election interference. What do we know about that, Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov?
Well, I was just reading about it this morning that they got to admit that the U.S. had poured, USAID had poured in millions of dollars. I don't know the precise dollar amount, but it's a high amount to support the pro-Western candidate, Maya Sandu, who had been trained at Harvard in 2024 elections against the I remember I did follow that election a little bit. There was the socialists had been in power in Moldova, who were closer to Russia, and the leader was a guy, I think Igor Dodon or something like that. And yeah, he had some statements in the article I was reading this morning that this was just, brazen corruption and foreign interference in their country. And she's far from a model Democrat. The leading opposition figure was very recently, I think, given a 7-year jail sentence on some seems to be ridiculous charges. So I mean, the hypocrisy. The U.S. has been crying for years and years about Russian interference in American elections, absent any proof. And as we discussed last time, more and more documentation is showing the intelligence agencies had no proof of any Russian interference. The Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Studies for Sanity group years ago, headed by a group of highly professional, competent people of very high integrity, the kind of people you want running any country intelligence service, people like Ray McGovern, who we know, John Kiriakou, Colonel Ann Wright, Larry Johnson. These are highly skilled, professional, intelligent people, and just people of high integrity. Anyway, their study found that this alleged hack was actually a leak, an insider leak. It had to have come from within the United States. It had nothing to do with Russia. These emails of Hillary Clinton that made her look bad, that were given to WikiLeaks. So we have, and Sean Henry, the head of CrowdStrike, admitted that also before Congress, although his testimony was suppressed for a number of years. But we have his testimony. He was one of the head of a cyber company that the DNC had hired. So we have no, he's saying exactly what the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity said. So we actually, in that case, we have zero proof at all, and the credible studies coming out are showing that the Russians had nothing to do with that election, and the documentation is showing that the Putin, the Russian leader, didn't like any candidate in that particular election. But we have pretty strong, and we have admissions from top government officials that the U.S. was the one meddling in elections in a country like Moldova, and again, not necessarily for the best candidate either. But I mean, any meddling, from my point of view, is wrong. We don't want foreign countries. I mean, it is legitimate not to want foreign countries meddling in your election. So why should that be acceptable for the United States? And of course, we know there's a long pattern of them doing that, including in Russia. The '96 election, it was even promoted in Time magazine on the cover, how the NED and U.S. advisors had assisted Boris Yeltsin, the pro-Western U.S. leader. So,
Well, what's interesting about this is for the last several years, and you're familiar with this, all throughout Europe, anyone who pushed back or ran against the status quo throughout Europe, they said the Russians are behind it. It didn't matter what it was. It was just like an automatic retort. Anything they didn't like, Brexit, the Russians are behind it. If they said,
yeah,
we don't like what's going on, the Russians are behind it.
exactly.
And in the U.S., we were told that a Russian troll kind of company spent $100,000 on the election, half of which was after the election. And that with that I think it was 48,000 of it was spent before the election. And that by spending $48,000 before the election and 52 after the election on memes such as things like a buff Bernie and tweets that would say things like, I told my mother I'm gay, that tweets like that, that's what turned the election. Meanwhile, the U.S. was spending millions in Moldova. The Romanian guy that was going to win, they came up with some cockamamie story, arrested him, said he's out. Marine Le Pen, they've arrested her, she's out. Like all over Europe, people that were literally going to win, that were ahead of it. AFD, I'm a lefty, I don't agree with the politics of these organizations, but fair enough. They want, the alternative for Germany, AFD, they were ahead, and they were about to label them like a terrorist organization and outlaw them until they got in a fight with the Trump people. So all throughout Europe, there was massive overt meddling, arresting, you name it, legal lawfare all over to stop anyone who was going to win. But yet the Russians spent $100,000, half of which was after the election. And that, let me add this. What's his name? The guy from New York that owns Bloomberg. He ran for 3 weeks, spent $500 million, and didn't move a single inch in the polls. 500 million in 3 weeks, didn't move an inch in the polls. But the Russians overthrew the entire election with $48,000 in 1 year.
Well, and even that, it was linked to an internet provider. It's not even known that it had any links to the Kremlin. And, most of the ads were, it was some kind of ad, I think clickbait stuff to get, and it was some kind of commercial venture, I believe,
Yes.
from my
Yep.
understanding. It was just clickbait to get people to click on it to access certain ads or buy certain products. And most of them were apolitical. And then they accused the Russians of trying to stir I mean, as if the African American population, which was oppressed in America for centuries, need the Russian to tell them that there's racism in America, or that when they blame the Russians when there was a protest over something like Black Lives Matter, which had absolutely nothing to do with the Russians. I mean, it was an internal matter. And it's an insult to any African American to say the Russians told them to protest because there's police brutality in America. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And they went after this group in St. Louis who was doing great
The
community work.
Uhuru, yeah.
Yeah, I
Uhuru.
mean, they built basketball courts for youth to get them not to play basketball on the weekend instead of doing joining gangs, and they had trying to develop black-run businesses, and that's a really destitute community. I've been there once in East St. Louis, so I mean they're doing a lot of good community work, and they attack them as Russian agents because their leader went to a conference once in Russia. So I mean, it really, yeah, it's a new McCarthy era we've been living under, and yeah, it fits a pattern. There's a book I read by Guy Matan I can recommend. He's a Swiss author, called Creating Russophobia, and he goes back in history and shows how it's a strategy of European, colonialism to blame the Russians for everything, to give an excuse just for expanding their power around the world or cracking down on domestic dissidents. And we've embraced that dubious European tradition.
Absolutely. So that being said, let's go to an article that we have for today, which is related. It was good to touch on that because people have to understand about what USAID is, and National Endowment for Democracy, and they are nothing but regime change operations. They are tools that the empire uses to go around the world and subvert democracy. And which brings you back to Russiagate. Which things are. I'm glad more things are coming out now. But to get back to Russiagate real quick, and that is to get back to that is the hubris, the absurdity for a country that not just does internal meddling in other people's elections, but literally said President Maduro is not the president of this country. That actually we've taken a guy here, some lunatic kook idiot named Juan Guaido. He's the president of the country. The idea that a country could have elections, that a former president, Jimmy Carter, could go to that country as an election observer, and a former president could say, this is the cleanest election I've ever seen in my life. I wish we had elections like that. I went there. I've been to, as an election observer. I'm like, well, hell, I wish we had elections like this. Boy, yeah, this is great. I mean, Republicans should be screaming. Everybody has an ID, and you got and they got a thumbprint machine. Okay, that's Garland Nixon. Now you can vote, right? Paper ballots, everything you could ask for. And the U.S. says, nah, that election's bad. This guy here, Juan Guaido, he's the president. And then when that all falls apart, they just like, oh, okay, well, never mind. Juan Guaido, you can go teach at a college here. He literally teaches democracy at a Florida college. And then they just decide, yeah, their election is terrible and this guy didn't win. And we then go and accuse someone else of interfering with our election by showing a Buff Bernie meme.
Well, and it just so happened that Juan Guaido wanted to privatize Venezuela's oil and sell their resources. And no wonder he had the support of about 1% of the Venezuelan population. Just like Navalny in Russia wanted to break up the Russian Federation. And most Russians, don't want that. They don't want their country balkanized. That's the agenda of the United States. And so he has 1% as well, but he was made into a hero. They use media propaganda to try and make these guys into heroes. They had this film. In the case of Navalny, he was a racist. Videos came out that he referred to immigrants as cockroaches. He was on the far right of the spectrum. And that's often the U.S. empire historically has allied with the far right fascist elements because of the fear of the left, governments that would retain control or assert control over the natural resources or adopt more populist measures, raise wages. That harms the profits of multinational corporations or ability of U.S. and U.S. corporations to loot that country and exploit its natural resources. So they always prefer, ideally, maybe they would like more of a center right, but they're willing to support the far right over any mildly left candidate. That's the historical pattern, and Venezuela fits that perfectly. And yeah, we can look at the case of Bangladesh if you want. This
Let's see.
article I recently did, and that's another regime change operation. And it doesn't mean the governments are perfect that are overthrown. Every country has its internal problems, and governance in general is difficult. But the U.S. has their own agenda. They'll seize on any problems in countries, real or imagined, that are more independent. And in the case of Bangladesh, I think the U.S. eyed some military facilities off the coast of Bangladesh, and promoting regime change operation in Myanmar, because that's a very strategic country whose government is close with China. So they are pushing for regime change against the Sheikh Hasina, who is the daughter of the founder of the father of modern Bangladesh and the country's first ruler. And she may not have been a perfect leader, but she was, a authentic, Bangladeshi leader who enacted various policies in the interest of her population. And the U.S. supported this regime change that brought in Mohammed Yunus, who is a darling of the world financial elite because of these micro finance schemes that he operated out of his Grameen Bank. And that's really, those schemes are popular among the financial elite because it seemingly offered a way to eradicate poverty without a leftist solution entailing redistribution of wealth or land reform or higher wages or nationalization policy that would harm the profits of multinational corporations. So they valued this as a solution, but it's no real solution because Yunus, it turns out, is a crook. His bank, he packages it that, oh, he's helping poor farmers out of poverty by giving them loans so they can start their own business. But he's actually, there's an excellent documentary by Tom Heineman that people should watch. And he did the real research. He went into these villages who got loans. He interviewed people, and they told them horror stories. Many were in tears that they were thrust into bankruptcy because the loan was misleading. They had to pay it back within 7 days, and they couldn't. Who can start a business and develop a profitable business in 7 days? And also, they were charging his bank, Eunice, was charging very high interest rates, and I think the interest escalated over time. So they couldn't pay it back after 7 days. Then they started to accrue more and more debt, and the interest rate was rising, and these people were thrust into tremendous debt. Then a lot of them had to migrate to the big cities to try and get work to pay off their debt, and they had to deal with loan sharks and the mafia, and they were suicide. Some committed suicide. A lot of families were ruined because of this. So this is no solution at all to poverty. And this guy is just an unscrupulous opportunist. He also was accused of massive tax evasion and tax fraud. That the film goes into those allegations against him. So this is the guy the U.S. puts in, and lo and behold, the situation in Bangladesh has been terrible since he came in, much like in Syria, and they relied on more Islamic extremists to sustain his power. And there were ethnic pogroms that occurred in Bangladesh after Yunus took power. And then what the NAD was doing, well, and I found in my research that the U.S. ambassador named Peter Hawes appears to play the key role because the U.S. media and State Department was presenting this as this kind of organic, heroic student uprising against the autocratic Sheikh Hasina. But I read a report by Indian intelligence that I found on the internet that assessed that Peter Hawes had met with opposition figures and student leaders in Mumbai and in Sri Lanka, and had been involved in and also met secretly with Yunus and had been coordinating the uprising, which was more a violent uprising against a legitimate government, and that he was a key figure. And then the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, was funding media outlets to promote anti Hasina propaganda to support the regime change operation. And they wrote an op ed praising Hawes as this great democratic figure. And meanwhile, he plotted this rebellion. And then what happened is after he left the State Department, he became an advisor for a liquefied natural gas company in Texas. That, surprise, surprise, Yunus is giving them major deals for this major refinery and to supply Bangladesh with natural gas. So he's cashing in big time, and these are the kind of shady, unscrupulous people we have. It's the so-called revolving door, and it's just corruption. I mean, unethical people, because he sold the entire country. The country's, it had its problem before. It was not ideal before, but it had a legitimate leader who was from that country, who they were trying to deal with some of their problems, and this is what happened. And now the country's in a terrible state. They've had terrible ethnic violence. There have been lynchings. People have been killed, and there's a climate of violence. Journalists are being persecuted like never before, and the economy is not improving. It's just being sold out to foreign corporate interests like this Texas company. So it's good for U.S. business, and unfortunately, U.S. foreign policy has always been designed to advance U.S. business interests at whatever the human cost. And then they fund these agents, propaganda networks, to make it seem like it's all about spreading democracy, but there's no democracy. He's the Awami League, Sheikh Hasina's party, from my understanding, is currently banned in the country, and he's delaying election. Now he's saying there's going to be election next year, but how free will those elections be? Given that I'm not sure the Awami League is going to be allowed to participate. And that was a dominant party before of Sheikh Hasina. And these Islamic parties, I think, are now gaining more in influence. So it's an ugly situation, and there's been a lot of misinformation about that. And the alternative media, the mainstream media, as we know, is very bad on these issues. Unfortunately, the alternative media has been no better, because when I was covering the story, I'm not a Bangladesh expert, but I picked up on something going on. I've just been reading stuff I can find on it, and I read into the background of Yunus, and I watched this documentary, which was very good, by Tom Heineman, very critical scrutiny of Mohammed Yunus and his Grameen Bank. And it was made, I think, 10 or 15 years ago. But I found the coverage on alternative media and Democracy Now! Horrible. They were praising Yunus and celebrating this revolution when he came to power, just like they did in Syria. And it shows how a lot of our alternative media is compromised. And that's why we need shows like this to spread, because we're providing independent analysis of the State Department.
Well, let me show you something here that people may find interesting. Here we go. Well, what do you know? The Hoover Institute, about Hoover. Located on the campus of Stanford University and in Washington, D.C., is the nation's preeminent research center, right? Okay. The Hoover Institution, right?
Yeah.
Condoleezza Rice is the director of the Hoover Institution and the Thomas and Barbara Stephenson Senior Fellow in Public Policy, right? So the neocon of all neocons is the director of the Hoover Institution, which is, of course, Stanford University. And for people that don't know, I have, when you look at Stanford University, it was named after a former governor and senator of California named Stanford, who was, well, let's just say this, he was governor. He decided to become a senator. And what he did when he ran for senator, he went to Washington, D.C., and he convinced the government of D.C. the U.S. government to grant 9 million acres to a company that he was intricately involved with and that he was financially promoting from to build a railroad. Okay, so all the way back to the guy that it was named after. It was all about how can we get money from the government. But the Hoover Institute is of Condoleezza Rice. That tells you it's a neocon of all neocons. And when you look at it, it goes back to this. That's what we're saying. Stanford University seems to be. I mean, what you're saying from them is we've got a organization. It's another one of their centers, right? The Stanford Center for Asia Pacific research. Well, the Stanford University seems to be, to some extent, just a front for the capture of the neocon control of a lot of elements of higher education. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, and the listener should be aware that Stanford just gave a major award to this news outlet, Netra News, which was a front of the National Endowment for Democracy that was designed to um, inflame the population against the Sheikh Hasina government and support the regime change operation that the U.S. was behind. And the underlying agenda was that Sheikh Hasina was resistant to building U.S. military facilities and bases that the U.S. wanted to build because Bangladesh, in part, was a way to gain more access into Myanmar and other parts of Asia to counter Chinese influence in those areas. And also, they wanted to open up the economy more to U.S. corporation like this liquefied natural gas company that the former ambassador is now a key advisor to. So this is not a objective media outlet. It's promoting political propaganda, and yet they won this major journalism award at Stanford's Shorenstein Center. Offers this. It's supposed to be a major center for the study of Southeast Asia, and Shorenstein Center is also, there's one at Harvard that's a big center for the study of media and training of journalists. And so, yeah, they're basically complicit now in this regime change operation because they're honoring, and they betrayed their own students. Because if you're studying journalism, I mean, and I studied journalism, and there are certain methods that you're taught. As far as objective reporting, you need to get two sides of a story. You need to get various sources to make your story credible. And there's a difference between journalism and political propaganda. But they're, awarding a political propaganda outlet whose bias is very clear, and I explained in the article. So this is a betrayal of the students, because the students are supposed to be learning certain standards for becoming professional journalists, not political propagandists. And then, yeah, it's aligned with U.S. interests in U.S. imperialistic foreign policies, and that's what they're teaching. I did some more research into this center. Some of the faculty, and what would students be learning, and they're not learning to think critically. They're learning to go ahead. They're not being told the whole story. They're being given a kind of propaganda version of events going on. That the U.S. is out there supporting democracy, and that you know, and there's no, if you look at the faculty, what they've published, there's nothing critical about U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia at all. And a lot of these faculty have deep ties, not just Condoleezza Rice, but they others who may be less well known, but they have deep ties to either the CIA or the State Department. They've worked there directly. I found that the director of that center, who was praising the Netra news outlet, was a South Korean professor, Ji Wook Shin. Uh, then I watched a video, so I was trying to get some information about him, reading stuff he wrote and said. And he's quite distinguished. He's published a lot of books, and I didn't have time to read all his books, and there are some good insights he has on South Korean politics. He's not a dumb guy, and you could learn something. I mean, I've studied in foreign policy schools with professors like that. I did learn a lot, and luckily, when I studied, the professor, although he was a right winger tied with the establishment, he was tolerant toward kind of more dissenting views among students or in their papers. He wasn't discriminatory if you wrote a critical paper. But anyway, this guy, yeah, I found the talk he gave online, and he's like, well, my sources in the they invited a speaker who was speaking on the North-South Korean conflict, and this is a big event, another big event at the Shorenstein Center, and he's introducing the speaker, and he's like, well, my sources in the CIA tell me he's one of the CIA best analysts the CIA, because the speaker was from the CIA, and then he's saying, but my sources in the CIA tell me he's one of the best CIA analysts they've ever had. So that would give me the indication. How does he have all these sources inside the CIA? So he's inviting a CIA person to speak. It seemed that this guy has a strong connection with the CIA. Then I watched the talk, and it was just what you would hear out of a John Bolton or a
Right.
Bush official about the North Korea threat and what do we do about their nuclear program, and no critical analysis of how the U.S. bombed the hell out of North Korea. About what are I mean, not trying to explain the North Korean ideology, how they tried to establish their own independent economy. I mean, it's just demonizing North Korea, stuff you find in the media, how the State Department presents it, and they're a threat to us, not how the U.S. may have provoked them or interest in regime change. So, and that's the kind of stuff you get. I was around those kind of schools, and they never reflect critically on U.S. or bring in speakers who would get students to think critically about how the U.S. has contributed to the division of the Koreas and was the one really with the aggressor who attacked North Korea and devastated them. That is suppressed. So unfortunately, that's what higher education has become in the United States, and it's tied to the state. And education should be independent. A good education system has to be independent of the state. And I think most American, that's what they want. I mean, America was set up as a democracy where we're not indoctrinated by the government, where we learn to think for ourselves and can formulate good ideas for good governance. But when you have the state controlling education, controlling the media, that's when you lose your democracy. And it's not just Trump, the Trump derangement syndrome that, oh, Trump came in and ruined democracy. Well, I think there were serious problems before Trump, and you have to look at these kind of phenomenon, how these, and yeah, they're neocons, but they're also adjuncts of the state. Whether it's the State Department, CIA, and they push the narrative of the U.S. state, and they're intolerant of any dissenting viewpoint or critical reflection on U.S. foreign policy, and that's again not what educational institutions should be about. They should be independent of the state, critical thinking, and ideas for a more humanistic vision for the future to be
Yeah,
debated. How we can proceed, what's really going on, and how we can do better. And it's a younger generation that might make a difference. But if they're being indoctrinated, there's no hope for the future.
exactly. Here's something that I think we should touch on. It's related. another article that you had way back in 2022. If the National Endowment for Democracy is subverting democracy, why aren't some of the left media call it out? And you've got NED's history should lead it to being renamed the National Endowment for Attacking Democracy, as Stephen Kinzer says. I got a book by Kinzer somewhere close by. But at any rate, what do we need to know about the NED?
Well, yeah, the NED was funding outlets like this Netra News in Bangladesh, not an independent journalistic outlet, but a political propaganda organ that was trying to incite the population against this leader that the U.S. had targeted for regime change, Sheikh Hasina. And that's the kind of thing they've been doing for generations now. The NED was set up in the 1980s. The reason it was set up was because the CIA used to do a lot of, and still does, a lot of propaganda. And the CIA used to fund foundations like the Asia Foundation that would, that were basically advancing U.S. propaganda. They would fund intellectuals and journals and bring in lecturers to Asian countries to push American narrative, and denounce communism and the left. And they co-opted a lot of intellectual, and they funded educational programs and exchanges. In the era of the church hearings, and there was some real investigative journalism that was done in that period, exposed that the CIA was funding, because Asia Foundation would present itself as this, human rights NGO, and promoting education and cooperation between nations, but really it was a front for the CIA, funded by the CIA, to advance U.S. propaganda insidiously. And that was exposed in major newspapers, the New York Times and others. And so it was an embarrassment for those organizations, for the CIA. Even people working there who didn't know where the funding came from resigned because they didn't want to be associated with the CIA. And that was a period where the CIA got a lot of bad press, because it was exposed the truly horrific things they were doing, whether it was sadistic mind control experiments, coups, assassination, you name it, they were doing it, the worst forms of human behavior. So there was, call to abolish the CIA. So they got smart. They formed new organizations that weren't called CIA, were called something else, a nice name, National Endowment for Democracy, and they basically picked up what the CIA was doing, and they're pretty open about it, that they promote political propaganda. They claim that they're promoting democracy or human rights, but they're doing what these foundations that were funded by the CIA are doing. They funded dissident, now NED, they'll fund dissident journals and promote intellectuals or journalists who are against governments that the U.S. wants to overthrow. And they're very selective. They claim to champion human rights and democracy, but they only pick on certain countries like Russia or China or Venezuela that are in the crosshairs of the U.S. government, because they're adopting more independent foreign and economic policies, and more nationalistic economic policies, whether leftist or simply more nationalistic. So they play up the human, they support Russian dissidents. They'll bring them or a speaking tour, or they support North Korean defectors to denounce the North Korean state, because the U.S. has had a 75-year regime change operation against North Korea. They'll fund, media outlets like this Netra News that's spread incendiary propaganda against a certain government in Bangladesh that the U.S. wanted overthrown. And so, really, they're subverting democracy because they're interfering, like what we were describing with Samantha Power, what she admitted. They're meddling in elections. They're pouring money to opposition groups, into media outlets that are spreading propaganda, and whose purpose is to inflame the people to rise up. They're often coordinating student networks and encouraging them to revolt. And so it's also functioned as a front for the CIA to funnel more and more money into dissident opposition groups that are trying to overthrow, in some cases through violent insurrections, governments. And some of the people that they've supported are outright fascists, like in Venezuela. They've championed this guy Leopoldo Lopez as this great democratic hero who's trying to overthrow this dictatorship. But in fact, Lopez was exiled in Venezuela because he was arrested on terrorism charges for inciting violence, violent pogroms. That was far worse than January 6th here, where the Guarimbas were burning, buildings, burning government property, courthouses, killing people, attacking supporters of the Venezuelan government, and violently, and there were many deaths. And he was a key instigator of that uprising, and the charges appear to be legitimate against him that forced him to flee to Spain. And he comes from a fascist. He has a fascist ideology, like Juan Guaido, like some of the groups the CIA has historically supported, like in South America, like the death squads in El Salvador in the 80s. He's of that kind of persuasion. He hates the left, and he violent character. So they're at times supporting these kind of people, very bad, pernicious individuals under the guise of democracy promotion, and inciting uprising like the one in Bangladesh that have devastated that country and led to ethnic violence and empowerment of very corrupt elements who will sell their country out to U.S. multinational corporations.
One of the things, I just give people an example. While jump away from this for 1 second. When before I got kicked off KPFK in LA, I used to have a show there. And this may be one of the reasons, because I brought this up and I complained about it. The mayor, NED, Karen Bass in the world. Before becoming Los Angeles 43rd mayor, Karen Bass served in the United States Congress. During part of that time, she also served on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, one of the more controversial non-government organizations in the world. Listen to this. While she was on the board, using a small part of the $250 million or so it gets from the federal government to, quote, help spread democracy around the world, help fund the Global Disinformation Index, another NGO that ranks American news websites on their trustworthiness, right? So they go on to talk about some of the, devious things that they've done. But the bottom line is, if you look at it, when I see an NED ghoul elected as mayor, my immediate thought is, this is just another regime change operation, that these are CIA puppets being put in positions. Look, you got all the Hollywood there and all these things. There was great suspicion about the fires, all these other things going on there. It's a hot spot of, radical Zionism there. You kind of assume that the intelligence operatives would say, we need one of our people in charge of Los Angeles.
Yeah, well, and I think they've been shown, one organization that they were shown to have funded with Bellingcat, which spreads a lot of propaganda in support of U.S. regime change operations. And I think, there's more and more evidence that they're meddling in U.S. elections, as you say, even maybe local elections. And there's a long pattern of that. I mean, I studied the careers of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And they create these kind of fake progressive heroes who are really tied with the CIA or other state agencies, and they're kind of these Manchurian candidates who will do their bidding and hoodwink liberals. And I think they use the Democratic Party more and more to get people more on the left to, it's a way of co-opting any independent or left-wing movement in the United States to bring in these kind of cutout characters and then to put them in positions of authority. So it's very dangerous for our democracy, along with countries around the world, which it has destroyed. And yeah, it's, by now a lot of information has come to light, so you can't say this is a conspiracy theory when there's a ton of documentation about things they've done. And sometimes their reports, they used to be accessible online. I think they become a little more guarded now, although they are not very transparent about the organizations they form. But if you go on they fund, but if you go on their website, like they will host events like celebrating. That's how I learned that Netra News was funded by them, because they hosted an event and they like celebrated Netra News. And so they don't disclose who they fund, but they periodically host events where they recognize their grantees, basically, so you can get a sense of some of the groups that they're funding, and know that concretely.
Well, there's this organization, Kit Clarenberg did some work on it in Great Britain. And what they found out, he, tried to track it down. It was a shady NGO, with they had an address and there was nothing there. And they had to go to another address, one of these things, right? And what he found out was, and it was just a neocon warmongering kind of organization, right? But what he found out, I might have brought this up to your attention before, is there was a young guy there. And during 2016, the guy who worked in this neocon, shady, MI6 funded operation flew to the United States and volunteered for the Bernie Sanders campaign, but never told anybody who he worked for. And then, so he started traveling with the Bernie's campaign, volunteering. And then all of a sudden he started showing up like the New York Times and Reuters and all of these other big time, government captured news organizations started interviewing him just out of the blue. This young, a guy who just was a Brit, and he says, "Oh yeah, I was in England, and I was so excited about Bernie. I decided to come over here." And I'm thinking, how does a young guy in his 20s fund such a thing? How many young guys in their 20s do you think about? Most people at that age who has money to fly all over the world, to volunteer for months and months without having a job, working for a campaign. And then all of a sudden, mysteriously, conveniently, Reuters and the New York Times and NBC and everybody wants to talk to you. And then he goes back, after the Sanders campaign, he goes back to England and he's hosting these meetings with military industrial complex, neocon country. And you're like, that sure seems the opposite of what he was just arguing when he was on the verge. So, these groups are interfering in U.S. elections kind of clandestinely. I think they're running, it seems to me, like spy operations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think they want to co-opt any independent social movement. So even a figure like Bernie Sanders is really suspect, because he claimed, join the revolution, and this is a political revolution, and yet he ends up endorsing Hillary Clinton, and he supports wars when the Democrats wage it. He
called
opposes
Maduro a dictator. If you notice, he calls Putin a dictator. He calls Maduro a dictator. Anybody, when the CIA says that guy's a dictator, you can rest assured that Bernie Sanders and AOC will do everything to scream it as loud as they can.
Exactly, and he was gung ho for the Ukraine conflict, and even on Israel, he was often defending Israel in the beginning. I mean, now he's come out; everybody's against that now. He joined the bandwagon. So and the COVID, he was just awful. He was supporting the censor. He's supposed to be against the pharmaceutical companies, and yet he's supporting the COVID lockdowns and dismissing anybody who's raising questions about how they manipulate the COVID pandemic and were profiting off that with these vaccines. He was nowhere to be found. So he's really a suspicious guy. And, I think you have to be suspicious of anybody in organized politics, because they co-opt and manipulate, and they're kind of shrewd. They get people who are disaffected, who might join real independent organizations and form a new party. If Sanders were authentic, he would form a new party, a real populist party like existed in the late 19th, early 20th century. And, he had the stature. to make that party quite effective. He could get himself and others into office in that party. So that's what he would do. Instead, he was steering people into the Democratic Party, into supporting Clinton and Biden as a kind of lesser evil, and that's, I think, part of their strategy. So, and then these news outlet like The Nation, I've read that magazine for years, and they sometimes have good independent reporting, but they're always so enthusiastic about the latest liberal messiah, and now it's a Zoran Mamdani, and you have to
Absolutely.
be very, very careful because the power elite are very smart, and they use these people to co-opt, to get people to buy into the electoral system that's corrupt, and not to form new independent parties. So be very careful, listeners, and don't drink the Kool-Aid. I mean, keep your skepticism. I'm not saying don't vote necessarily. You might want to vote for them as a lesser evil, but you have to be weary about what kind of tricks they're trying to play with these kind of characters.
Well, see, I think a guy like that, certainly Bernie has a very clear job, to provide the um to provide the false hope that somewhere in the Democratic Party there's still an element that could, that could be saved. That there's still
Mhm.
an element there that could be directed back, and then that element could then take over the party. Blah blah blah. Do but what happens is when Bernie has this, there's all of these people involved who are trying to do things to push back against the system. Well, what I think, to me, this guy comes in not to spy on Bernie. Bernie's done. They know where he's coming from. It's to spy on the elements in there, the other people that are volunteering, that are working, that truly believe that, the other organizations that are working with Bernie. This guy can come in, he can infiltrate these other organizations, he can get information, he can get data, he can get connections, you know what I mean? So Bernie herds all of these poor suckers into one room, and this guy then comes into the room and infiltrates all that he wants. And then when it's all over, Bernie then can go on the stump with Hillary and say, we've got to support Hillary. But this guy has all the inside information on everybody that was working with Bernie. That's the way I see it.
Absolutely. And then they can use that information in the future. If any of these people try and go off on their own or have a certain charisma that they develop their own following, then they've got the goods on them. They know all about them. And yeah. And one thing the intelligence agency do is they get blackmail information on people. And they plan years ahead. So yeah, maybe he's scouting out to see in this group who may be somebody who would be on the so-called deep state's radar in 5-10 years from now.
And then they find some guy he's on the deep state's radar, but maybe he's gay clandestinely. Maybe he's likes to smoke a lot of weed. Maybe there's something in there. This
Exactly.
is a guy that like has a girlfriend and he's cheating on his girlfriend, his wife, or something like that. They can find something that's
Absolutely.
not quite perfect, and this guy could really go up, but they find that, and then they can start digging into that. Oh, this guy has a weakness, he likes girls or something, I don't know, a lot of, and he has 10 girlfriends or whatever it is, you know what I mean, he gets high or something
Yeah.
like that.
Well,
They
probably,
find some chink
one
in the
guy,
armor.
yeah,
Huh?
one guy report, gives a survey of some of the people in the Sanders campaign and who may be, influential in the future. And then
Yep.
there's another wing that, if they get on the blacklist, then they're going to dig into this guy, his
Exactly.
finances, his personal life.
Yeah, exactly. They go into it and they find out, oh, that he um once declared bankruptcy. He had an ugly divorce where his wife accused him of something, whether it's true or not. You know what I mean? So the future guys, and they find out everything they can. Well, this guy's really going somewhere. He's on the move. People really like him. He has a great personality. And then they start digging, and they just find anything they can find, or they make something up. Or they send in, if he's really, they send in some honeypot thing where some girl comes in and gets him into something. Maybe he gets arrested. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Whatever.
or they'll get him to work for them. They'll offer him a job somewhere with a lot of money and say, "Oh, you're going to earn a lot more money," and they can get
Exactly.
people to do certain work. If they're identified as talented, they may have skills that they can use for their own purposes. So,
Yeah, exactly. So you
and
get
then they have
people.
that credibility. Oh, he's a progressive. because you see these guys sometime on talk shows. Oh, he was Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor, and
Oh,
now he's pushing the war and regime change in Syria or Venezuela. So they use that stature that he's a progressive, and they co-opt because I think they're worried that an independent anti-war movement could develop again, like occurred in the '60s, or youth counterculture rebellion. That's what they don't want. So they'll get people on the left, and a lot of intellectuals get co-opted, and journalists, because they have a certain credibility. Like if they work for Bernie Sanders, and then they'll get them when they support the regime change in Syria or start ridiculing the Assad lovers. It has some weight because they're identified as a Bernie guy. They're a real leftist, and he's saying don't touch us. Say anything nice about Assad, and.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's the one guy, Matt Deuce or whatever, that
Yeah,
worked
I
with
always see
Bernie,
him exactly.
and he was like, that's the other thing. They get somebody close to the top in different
Yeah.
organizations, kind of like, do you remember the thing where they were supposed to be trying to kidnap Christine Whitmer or whatever? The
Hmm.
FBI,
Yeah.
and they found out that like this so-called organization that was planning on kidnapping the governor, that like the second in command was an FBI guy, and he was like coming in saying, people, yeah, let's have a meeting, I'll pay for everything, I'll pay for hotels and food. And they end up sometimes having to drop this stuff when they find out that like the instigator of all the stuff was an FBI informant in the first place. And I think that's their other plan. Find these organizations that are working with Bernie, then I can co-opt, I can get instigators, I can get agent provocateurs and all of those. And a guy like that is the most valuable person.
Hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, that Deuce, I see him in a lot of liberal outlets as a supposed liberal voice, but he's often a voice for kind of neocon view. Like he's often on Democracy Now. Uh,
Yeah, those are the worst. That's the worst. I've been saying for a while. I'm very suspicious if you look into AOC's background. There's a
yeah.
lot of stuff of AOC's background that makes you go, that doesn't make sense. I thought, and the whole portrait that she was a poor, broke, just nobody off the street who wore holes in her shoes when she had holes in her shoes, and you look at it and like, well, she's highly educated, and it looks like she was funded by some arch Zionists. And, wait a minute, that doesn't look like a holes in the shoes waitress who, the story
Yeah, they
doesn't.
tell us. Oh, I haven't looked into her background, but I did look into Obama's background, and
Oh,
they create a cover story, and it's yeah they groom these people, and yeah they're targeting the left because that's what they're worried about, an independent anti-war, genuinely left-wing progressive movement that would really challenge the power elite. So they groom these Manchurian candidates, and it'd be interesting to look more into Sanders' background, how he got to where they are, because yeah, there's usually somebody powerful getting them there, and they kind of create this persona. I mean, most politicians, in a way, they're like actors. They develop this kind of public persona, and they're groomed for that, especially the more prominent ones. So I think yeah, I'd like to look more into AOC and what the real story there is, and who her funders were.
well,
Because all politics is about money. I mean, there's somebody they need the money to get in, and there's moneyed interest. And even if you look into Sander, there is a study by Peter Schweitzer. I guess people on the left don't read him because he's conservative, but he's done a lot of good research on people like Sanders, and he shows his connection with this wealthy real estate investor in Burlington named Pomerleau, who financed his early career. And he did when he was the mayor of Burlington, he did all kinds of favors for Pomerleau. Yeah, he was supposed to be this socialist against the billionaires, yet he's funded by one, and he's doing and he supported this plan for the development of Burlington downtown that really benefited Pomerleau and his real estate interests. So he's no different from anyone else, and he needed the money. He wouldn't ever be in power if Pomerleau didn't support him. So, and he gets people on the left to vote for him because they think he's their champion. And unfortunately, that's how politics works.
Yep, I tell everybody, I had a point in my life where I was approached by a billionaire, literal billionaire, whose contracts he sold his company, the latest company he sold it to Northrop Grumman at that time for $587 million, who approached me and literally said, "Have you ever considered running for office? Here's my phone number. I can help you." That happened to me. I can tell the name of the person, the stuff. You know what I mean? I have witnesses. And I
Yeah.
think back to this day and I'm like, interesting about that. Why in the world would a billionaire say to little old Garland, you know,
Well,
here's this other
he
person?
saw some talent. He probably heard you on did he hear you on the radio or?
At the time we met, I was with the ACLU on the board, and the ACLU of Maryland was having their 30th anniversary, and they had a major donors table. And I was sitting at the major donors table. We were all suit and tied, and he and I talked. Now,
Yeah.
I sat next to
He
him, and
probably
we
liked your
talked for like two.
personality. He saw, look, this is a friendly guy. He's got a charismatic personality. You know, you've been on the radio or in the future
Yeah,
you
I'd been on
will.
the radio. He
I
knew
mean,
that I was a
you
radio
have what it
personality.
takes. You have the charisma, the speaking skills, the intellect. You'd be a great person.
He gave me his phone
They
number.
find
I'm in the
people like
process
that,
of
and
selling
then
my, yeah, he says, I'm
yeah,
in the process of selling my company. And when I get, it's going to take about another 6 weeks. When I get done, here's my phone number. Call me. You ever, and he's like, I can help you. And later on, I thought back and I'm like, I realized what I can help you mean. It
yeah,
doesn't mean I can help you. It means I'll just call the Democratic Party of Maryland and say, I want this guy to run for such and such. How much? And when you got that kind of money, how much?
exactly.
And if they say, well, if you donate $2 million, well, we've got an open spot right here. Okay, make it 2.5. I
Hmm.
want to make sure this guy gets it. And then he just calls me and he says, this is what you need to do. Shut up. Don't ask any questions. He was building corporations and then selling them to the government. And guess what? At the time, I looked up his company and he had all of these contracts, CIA, NSA. He did cybersecurity. His
Mm-hmm.
company was called the Essex Corporation, ESSEX. He's
Hmm.
dead now. Lynn Moodispaw was his name.
Hmm.
And he was like, he had like uh uh um um a contract, and it would be like Project Black Widow, 387 million CIA, Project so and so, $212 million NSA, Project blah blah. And I'm like, wow, holy crap. So I think they were trying to co-opt me.
Definitely.
Yeah. All
Yeah.
right. Well, thanks a lot, everybody. Don't forget, go to covertactionmagazine.com. Let me show you one more time before we go. I often thought back, man, oh man, they would have, while in fact, I would have lived a very wealthy life. I'd have been nothing but another regime change puppet. Covert
Hmm.
Action Magazine. There you go. All kinds of big stuff going on, and people don't realize DC was just the start. Trump targets the cities nationwide. I'll just say this before we go. What people don't realize, covertactionmagazine.com. What people don't realize, you got these concerns. Oh yeah, they're trying to stop crime. The government does not put soldiers into cities to stop crime. They don't care about crime. They're not looking out for us. They're not like, oh, the poor citizens, they're victims of crime. We better send some soldiers out. No, they're not. They're putting them out in preparation to suppress civil unrest because they know as things crash, they'll have civil unrest. They get us accustomed to soldiers on the street. They get us, yay, they're putting soldiers on the street. And we just pray, yes, send more. And they're like, no problem. We'll be happy to send more to suppress crime. And the crime is when everything goes to hell and you go out and say we're opposed to genocide and we're opposed to our government, everything crashing, all of our money going to the war, blah, blah, blah. Guess what? They're all there to suppress the protest. So, all right, thanks a lot, everybody. Follow me on Rockfin and Rumble and Telegram and all that kind of stuff. Big thanks to my Patreon people. You're what helps keeping the show going if you can afford it. Patreon, buy me a coffee, PayPal, whatever. That would be great. Don't forget, I also now have a P.O. box number. So if you want to send something snail mail, just look at the bottom. My P.O. box number is scrolling across there. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Jeremy Kuzmarov, we're out.